Hello everyone, I'm Jay Kempton and I'm here to introduce to you a special benefit available to you through your employer's health plan. It's called the Kempton Premier Provider Program. Through the Kempton Premier Provider Program, you and your covered family members have available to you the potential to have certain medical procedures paid for at 100% with no employee out-of-pocket whatsoever. So in essence, your deductible, copays, and coinsurance can be completely waived. The purpose of the Kempton Premier Provider Program is to provide a benefit to you when you use certain medical professionals around the region, and when you use those professionals for certain voluntary and elective medical procedures, you may be able to have those medical procedures for free. Your deductible, copay, and coinsurance potentially can be completely waived where you or your covered family member have zero out-of-pocket expenses for those medical procedures. Remember, Kempton Premier Providers do not replace your current benefit plan. This is a special benefit that is in addition to your benefit plan. Kempton Premier Providers are also for voluntary and elective medical procedures. These are going to be things that are non-emergent. It's not an emergency that you have. They're also going to be for things that there's not any time sensitivity to. An example that we use is if you find yourself in a car accident and you're bleeding, that's not a time to call Kempton Premier Providers. Again, this is for voluntary and elective procedures only. It is an incredible benefit. It greatly benefits you as a patient, and it also benefits your employer because your employer's benefits are self-insured. The more that you can help your employer stretch that benefit dollar, the better your benefits can be over time and the lower cost to you out of your paycheck. This is one of those tools that assists you and your employer in maintaining a high quality benefit plan. Kempton Premier Providers are not part of some new PPO network. Some of these providers, they do participate in most insurance companies' PPO networks. However, they've reserved their best pricing for their bundled cash pricing that is available through Kempton Premier Providers. Kempton Premier Providers are not necessarily just for local participants. In other words, if you don't have a Kempton Premier Provider right there in your hometown, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use Kempton Premier Providers. The procedures that are offered through Kempton Premier Providers, the pricing is so good that in many instances, your employer is actually willing to pick up your reasonable travel and lodging expenses, whether that happened to be a tank or two of gasoline or a hotel stay. In some situations where folks have come from multiple states away, employers have even paid for the price of an airplane ticket. Again, that's for reasonable travel and lodging, and your Kempton patient advocate can assist you with determining whether or not your procedure would be eligible for a travel or lodging reimbursement. These providers are progressive, free market thinkers. At this point, you're probably asking yourself, well, how do I avail myself of this program? Well, the first step really starts with when you have had a medical procedure recommended to you by a specialist. And I'm going to use the example of an ankle. Let's say that you've had an ankle that's been giving you trouble for several months, and you've gone to your primary care doctor and they've told you at some point we may have to do surgery on that ankle. The next time that you go back to them, they say, you know, it may be time, I'm going to recommend that you go see a specialist so we can see whether or not that ankle really does need surgery. When you go to that specialist, and hopefully you've used an in-network provider to take a look at that ankle, at the point in which that specialist says, yes, your primary care doctor was right, I do think it's time that you have surgery on that ankle, that is the point in which you have a decision to make. You can go ahead and take the advice of that specialist. They will most likely send you to another in-network facility for that surgery where you would have to meet your deductible, your copay, your coinsurance, whatever the patient's financial responsibility would be under the plan would be what you would be responsible for. However, if you wanted to see whether or not that procedure could be available through a Kempton Premier Provider, you would need to tell that specialist, time out, doc, I'd like to make a phone call and see if I have an enhanced benefit available where I may be able to get this surgery done at no cost to me. At that point, you're going to call a Kempton Premier Provider patient advocate at the number listed on your screen. When you make contact with your Kempton Premier Provider patient advocate, they're going to ask you what procedure were you recommended from your specialists. You may need to provide an actual technical description of that procedure, possibly even a procedure code. You should be able to get that procedure code from your referring specialist. We will need that to determine whether or not your procedure can be done at a Premier Provider. Once we know the exact procedure that you've had recommended to you, your patient advocate will search through all of the different procedures that are offered by all of the different Premier Providers to see if your procedure can be done at one of them. The chances are very likely that your procedure may be able to be done not just at one Kempton Premier Provider, but maybe at several Kempton Premier Providers. Once you've decided that you'd like to go ahead and move forward and maybe have that procedure done at a Premier Provider, call us back at your patient advocate number that's here on the screen. At that point, we will work with you and with the Premier Provider that you have chosen to work out a schedule that works for you and for the provider. So after the scheduling has been done with your Premier Provider, the last thing that your Kempton patient advocate is going to do is issue you a voucher. When you arrive at the Premier Provider at the time of your appointment, you're going to present them with this voucher. We want you all to think about this voucher as almost like a boarding pass to get on an airplane. If you don't have your boarding pass, you can't get on the plane. If you don't have this voucher, you can't have your procedure paid at 100%. When you present your voucher, the provider will also have a copy of that voucher as well, verifying that you're at the right place at the right time. As a reminder, all Kempton Premier Provider procedures have got to be coordinated through your Kempton Premier Provider patient advocate. Again, the way that you get started is you dial the number on the screen, and then your patient advocate will really walk you through the steps from there. Now remember, Kempton Premier Providers are available in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, South Carolina, and Illinois, and that is growing generally every week. To find up-to-date information on the Kempton Premier Providers that we have arrangements with, please go to www.kemptonpremierproviders.com. The Premier Provider Patient Advocate line, the toll-free number is 1-866-898-7219. Thank you for your attention.